We know from Addy's conversations with Castleton's elders that the Garland ceremony didn't change much during the early and middle years of Victoria's reign. But in the 1890s, the railway finally reached this previously remote part of the Peak District.
And in 1894, the passenger trains of the Midland Railway began steaming through the Home Valley. Nowadays, there's still a good service of regional express trains on this line, but the only ones that stop are these elderly sprinters which rattle their weary way between Manchester and Sheffield, calling at Edale, Bamford, Hathersage, Grindleford and here at Hope. And on summer weekends they also bring small groups of ramblers and hikers here into the Hope Valley. But the vast majority of visitors come by road, so nowadays the station's often deserted. But back in the 1890s, when Hope Station had waiting rooms and porters, it was a major destination for day excursions from all of the surrounding conurbations. And so when this station opened, the number of visitors coming to Castleton rocketed. Previously, to get there, you either had to walk or else come by horse, and that meant that although the place was popular, visitors were numbered by the dozen. From the summer of 1894 onwards, excursion trains brought them by the thousand. The local reporters from the regional papers in Derbyshire and Sheffield got to the Hope Valley long before the railway did, but the earliest mention of the Garland ceremony that we've found so far is actually a reader's letter that appears in the Buxton Advertiser in 1869. And finding that information was made so much easier now that the British Library have made it possible to search their national newspaper archive online. Now, the local newspapers started carrying reports of the Garland ceremony from the 1870s onwards, and that meant that people who were interested in such things, antiquarians, could look at the date, May the 29th, and conclude that the ceremony must be about Charles II. However, if they'd have been able to get to Castleton to actually see the ceremony, they would have realised that the people involved were the village bell ringers. They did the dancing outside the pub, and it was a bell ringer who carried the garland. Now, this is very much like the old May Day parade, only instead of dancing around the village for pennies, they've chosen to stop outside each pub and dance for pints, just like the old Lord of Misrule game, which ties in with the other main character who's now called the consort, but in those days was simply called the woman, and she was a sort of comedic pantomime dame and accompanied the man wearing the garland. These steps, which the men used to do, were collected by Cecil Sharp in 1912 when he spoke to Edwin Barber, who had been one of the last ringer dancers. Working from Sharp's notes, Jed Morton of the Chapel Morris Men has re-choreographed the sort of dance that they used to do, although Barber did say that the actual dance varied from year to year. Now, in the 1890s, the coming of the railway must have put the ringers under a lot of pressure to make the ceremony a bit more of a spectacle for all the extra visitors. And added to that, 1897 was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee year, and villages throughout the land were putting on children's pageants in June to show support for the Empire and the Queen. But Castleton did it a fortnight earlier, on Garland Day, when they introduced girl dancers to their ceremony to catch the prevailing mood of the royal celebrations. Now, it may be that they only intended to try the girl dancers for Jubilee year, but as we can see, it made for a better spectacle, and so was soon accepted by all concerned. So, whoever re-choreographed the men's dance for the girls got it spot on. And Kay Harrison from the Castleton Historical Society, who's been researching these and other aspects of the Garland ceremony, has taken a break from the archives to visit the Bull's Head on Cross Street to talk about that change to mine hosts Michelle and Pete.
Now the question is, who was the first dance mistress? Now most people think that it was actually Ivy Johnson standing here. She was from the Peak Hotel, very musical family, but she would have only been 8 years old in 1897, so not likely to have been her. We found some interviews with some elderly residents in the 1960s who were actually children round about the turn of the century, and they said that it was a Miss Partington that used to first teach the dancing. And we found out that she was called Annie Partington. She was a music teacher and she lived here at the Bull's Head, and she was a daughter-in-law of the landlady. This photograph was taken in either 1897 or 1898, and we think that Miss Partington is the lady standing there right in the middle. This was taken to celebrate the change from the men to the children.
That's the first year they've had children?
Yes, we think it's actually the oldest photograph that there is of the Garland ceremony. So the children's dance that you see today actually was created right here in this pub, and it's still going on today.
And by a lucky coincidence, in August 2018, the Castleton Historical Society was contacted by Annie's great-great-granddaughter, who told us that this most significant of players in the story of the Garland was still remembered in her family as a noted pianist. But even so, I think that in those days it's unlikely that a woman could have been the driving force behind such a major change in a male-dominated hierarchy like the Garland Committee. However, Kay's researchers have come up with a more likely candidate.
Henry Bowman Shepherd. He became the village doctor in 1896. He was a big man, and for the next 30 years he played a big part in village life. And it was for him that the Garland procession made this extra stop at what is still called Doctor's Corner.
All the other stops are outside the village's 6 pubs, where all those in the procession get a liquid reward.
Orange juice!
But this stop's different. It's on the corner of Back Street, next to what used to be the doctor's house.
Back in his day, this wall had a gate in it that led into Dr. Shepherd's garden.
From his gate, he got a grandstand view of the dancing. Now, the question is, did this amount to VIP treatment for bringing this new look to the ceremony?
Dr. Shepherd retired in 1924, but his successor, Dr. Bailey, continued to get the same special treatment until he retired in 1962.
Later, the gateway was walled up. The surgery moved to Hope, and for a few years, to help keep traffic flowing, the procession didn't stop there.
But in 1990, the Garland Committee decided that this stop had become part of the tradition, so they still dance at Doctor's Corner.
And an earlier incumbent, John Winterbottom, who was the medical officer and public vaccinator for Castleton for over 40 years, also had a connection with the Garland story.
That's right. His coachman, George Watts, is the earliest Garland king whose name we know, and he retired from that role when his master died in 1870. He then handed on his old livery coat, which he wore for the ceremony, to his successor, Thomas Hall. That old coat continued to do service until 1897, when the ceremony took on its new look, with girl dancers and a smart new ceremonial jacket for the Garland king. Comparing the two coats, you can see that the old one has a folksy look with homemade rosettes, whereas the replacement has definitely got regal pretensions to go with what by then had become the belief that the Garland king was the personification of Charles II.
Now, I think that in 1897, the Garland Committee bought this new costume, which Kay was able to try on recently when it came back to Castleton, because the Royal Jubilee created the right atmosphere for a new broom like Dr. Shepherd, who later became their chairman, to persuade the ringers to sweep aside the old story of a Mayday Jack in the Green, which most people had long forgotten about anyway, in favour of a new narrative that the ceremony was all about a king hiding in a tree.
Now, as it happened, those changes from a jack to a king and from Morris to maiden dancing gave the ceremony a stronger connection with the local community, if only because the dancing girls all had proud parents. And so, consequently, in the late 1890s, the Garland ceremony got a new lease of life.
However, the death of Victoria and the coming of the 20th century inevitably brought changes. And as we can see from this scrapbook of press cuttings, children's pageants became popular. And in 1912, there's the first report of a maypole in the marketplace.
Maypoles and pageants were seen as a way to modernise old traditions, and Ginny Royce, who was then a young teacher, is said to have been one of the instigators. The pageants were short-lived, but the maypole dancing has survived, and throughout her life, Ginny remained involved with the Garland, providing important information about its history, such as the story of Doctor's Corner, to the English Folk Dance and Song Society.
In 1914, they appear to have done the maypole dances at the host pub before the parade, but thereafter it returned to the marketplace, where it's remained ever since.
But the question is, has there been a Garland ceremony ever since? Because the school logbook says that in 1916 the children didn't get their usual half-day holiday because there weren't any Garland celebrations. However, local folklore has it that a cut-down ceremony did take place to uphold the tradition by carrying the garland round the village on a pole before placing it on the tower as usual. Presumably, at a time of conscription, shortages and restrictions, there just wasn't the appetite for the usual celebrations.
In October 1919, the War Memorial on the Triangle was unveiled with Dr. Shepherd at the centre of the proceedings.
But the first report that I've found that mentions the Garland ceremony finishing there with an act of remembrance wasn't until 1926.
In May 1923, the church was being repaired, so that year the Garland finished up not on the tower but on the nave.
Now, I haven't actually seen a photograph, but as far as I know they were doing work on both the bells and the masonry that year. So I would have guessed the tower would have been covered in scaffolding, and for that reason I think they would have put the garland on that particular pinnacle on this side of the nave.
In 1935, John Walker, who was a Peak Cavern guide and Blue John craftsman, went to Manchester straight after the Garland ceremony.
This is the regional programme. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we present you
And at 10:10, he broadcast an eyewitness account on the North region of the BBC.
Between the wars, the Ringers continued to organise the Garland ceremony and use the proceeds to fund their annual supper. But in 1940, when their numbers were depleted, the running was handed over to a committee of local people who used the funds for the war effort as well as for charities.
Hello there.
These days they have a street collection where you don't get a sticky badge but rather a sprig of oak. And collecting all this greenery involves quite a bit of specialist knowledge because there aren't many oak trees in the Castleton area.
This cost us £1,200 to lay this 2-hour event on. So we have a charity dinner in early spring, and that helps us to raise enough money for the insurance and for the horses.
And that's because these days there aren't any local farm horses that can be borrowed for the night.
For many years, Peter Eyre's Brough Shires suitably turned out were the equine stars of the parade. And when he retired in 2015, the committee had to look as far and wide as Lincolnshire
in order to find horses that were placid enough to cope with all the distractions and decibels of the parade and ceremony.
The liquid refreshments for the band, the dancers and the helpers are provided by the 6 landlords, who are given the numbers in advance so that Brian and his team can set about their thirst-quenching duties with speed, efficiency and pride.
I think they're quite grateful that I'm always there generally.
Best job in British folklore.
But of course there's more to the committee's work than just organising the street collection and the beer. There's hiring the horses, arranging third-party insurance and first aid cover, as well as recruiting the dancers, a task which becomes more difficult every year because the number of families living in Castleton is falling. That's why boys are now eligible to dance, and the catchment area has been increased to the whole of the Hope Valley. Up until a few years ago, the event was policed by the local bobbies, but now the committee have to provide their own stewards to implement the road closure order that applies whilst the procession is blocking the main road. And all that's in addition to collecting the flowers, making the garlands, erecting the maypole, and then running the actual ceremony, starting with decking the tower the evening before. Jonathan Haddock, the current Garland King, is the committee secretary, so he knows the setup from inside and out, as does the chairman, Peter Outram, who was the previous king and led a special parade back in 2000 when many of the women who had danced when they were girls were invited to step back in time for the millennium. 1954 was another interesting year because there were disruptions to both the Abbotsbury Garland, one down on the south coast, and the Castleton Garland, and they were both caused by what you might call overzealous officials. In Dorset, it was the village constable who stopped the children parading their garland through the village because he said that collecting pennies was tantamount to begging, which was illegal. The story made the front pages, and a couple of weeks later in Castleton, the Reverend Haydock removed the garland from the church tower after just one day, claiming that he'd heard voices telling him to do it. He later apologised to the Garland committee, and a year or so later he moved to another parish. Now, interestingly, we're told that in the 19th century the garland used to remain on top of the church tower for the whole year, but nowadays it stays in place for just 1 week until the people who put it up there lower the withered remains back to the ground in the first week of June. The Queen Posy, which for a few years was removed from the garland at the churchyard gates because it was thought to be pagan, now gets removed at the base of the tower in readiness for being placed on the War Memorial. Before the First World War, the posy was presented to one of the village wives in the expectation of a generous donation from her husband, and that was the only official role there was for women in this ceremony, and that's not surprising because I believe this started off as a May Day fundraising exercise purely for the bell ringers. But it's somewhat surprising that when the Garland ceremony was rebranded as being about Charles II, that this king of all our kings continued to be accompanied by a rather dowdy pantomime dame, rather than a fine restoration lady.
The costume was horrendous. It was held together with safety pins and string. My great aunt told me it was just somebody's old Victorian evening dress. That was quite awful.
Jean Abbott has good reason to remember that old costume because in 1956 she was at the centre of a change that redefined the role of the consort.
It came about because up until then Tommy Liversidge had done it wearing the most horrendous ginger wig and veil, and he simply felt that he was getting beyond doing it. He was getting elderly, and also times were changing, and it was just becoming a little bit embarrassing, I think. So he just retired. My father was on the committee and simply came home and said they've decided you're going to do it. So in 1956, I was 16. I wore the ginger wig and the veil and became the consort. The following year, I did get a new costume, a very beautiful blue silk velvet Stuart riding costume. I made the William Hickey page of the Daily Express as a huge photograph. So yeah, my ratings went up somewhat.
Jean had been part of the Garland since she started dancing as a young girl in 1947, following in the footsteps of her great aunt, who had been one of the original batch of girl dancers who made such a big change back in 1897. Their involvement reinvigorated the ceremony and kept it alive and kicking through the first half of the 20th century. And then, in 1956, the change to a female consort on a wet May the 29th, just like it was in 2013, reinforced the idea that the Garland ceremony was all about Charles II, rather than being a Georgian revival of a mixed bag of pagan rituals and medieval May games. And apart from those that I've already mentioned, both rush gathering, which involved bringing natural matting into the church, and Roman soldiers are both in the frame, the latter because the ceremony is said by some to commemorate the rescue of sacrificial maidens from bloodthirsty Mamtor druids, or even, as the scholarly Mr. Addy later favoured, a link with a pagan European Green Man Fertility Festival, which in 1906, long before Roy Judge's work on 18th century May Day parades, seemed like a reasonable connection. 50 years later, in 1956, there were some criticisms of the change to a female consort, but they were short-lived because this new look made for a better spectacle, as well as providing a star role that the girls from the chorus line of dancers could aspire to when they were older. But the number of eligible children is falling, and Castleton School is on the verge of closure. So, does that mean that the Garland ceremony is on its last legs? Well, because it's a bit of a mongrel, the Garland ceremony is adaptable. So perhaps tomorrow's generation will find a solution that will keep the music playing, although perhaps to a different beat.
The Garland ceremony has always involved youngsters as musicians, helpers or dancers, so there's still a few generations in the pipeline who could take up the reins of this ancient ceremony if they're able to stay in the area. And who knows, their solution might mean a smaller, cheaper ceremony without horses, so just as in Kilburn they could pull the king and consort through the village in a cart. Or perhaps a bigger event, like the ones in Cornwall, that will bring in the tourists and the money. Or will it just fade away, like the one at Abbotsbury? And it's that third option that Sydney Oldall Addy anticipated as being the most likely when he surveyed the scene back in 1901. The Garland ceremony has always been surrounded by dark clouds foreboding its imminent demise. But so far, it's always managed to survive.